I'm a 23-year-old guy, and I'm about to tell you about one of the most frustrating experiences I've had in my family. It started off as me wanting to do something amazing for my parents, something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. I didn't want it to be just another family trip. I wanted it to be special. This isn't one of those I'm upset because of a minor inconvenience stories. This is about how my attempt to create an unforgettable experience for my parents turned into an emotional roller coaster that I never saw coming. My parents have always been there for me. They're not perfect, but they're good people. Over the years, I noticed something that stuck with me. They'd always talked about going on a tropical vacation for their 30th anniversary. They never got around to it, though. The reason? Money. Growing up, we didn't have a ton of extra cash to spend on luxury vacations, so this idea stuck with me for years. I knew how much they wanted it, and I knew they deserved it. I've been working a side hustle for a while now, doing everything from freelance writing to odd jobs. It's not easy work, but it's paid off. After months of saving every penny I could, I finally had enough money for something big. I wanted to do more than just buy them a gift. I wanted to give them an experience, something they'd never forget. I knew exactly what they needed, some time away, just the two of them, somewhere warm and relaxing. A place where they could leave the stress of daily life behind and just enjoy each other's company. After a lot of research, I found the perfect place, an all-inclusive resort in a tropical destination. I'd saved enough to cover everything, the flights, the resort stay, the excursions, all of it. I paid for it up front, so they wouldn't have to worry about a single thing. Everything was set. I was so excited to share this with them. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a dream come true, and I was the one who made it happen. I felt proud, honestly. I could already see how happy they'd be when they found out. One evening, I decided to tell them over dinner. I had the reservation printed out in a folder with all the details. When I told them, their faces lit up. They couldn't believe it. They were beyond thrilled. There was so much gratitude in their eyes as they thanked me over and over again. This is going to be the best vacation ever, they kept saying. My mom even started tearing up, and my dad, who's usually pretty stoic, was clearly moved. It felt like I had done something right for once. I had finally made my parents happy in a way they'd never expected. But of course, there was a catch. I had spent months planning everything, and I was careful to make sure it would be a private trip. I wanted it to be just the three of us, my parents and me. No cousins, no aunts or uncles, just the immediate family. It would be a peaceful, intimate getaway where we could bond and enjoy the quiet of the beach. I thought this would be perfect for them. After all, they had sacrificed so much for the family over the years, they deserved to get away and just relax. So I made sure to say, I've planned everything already, and it's just the three of us. No extra guests. Okay? They agreed right away. It seemed like they were on board, and I couldn't have been happier. We even started talking about the details, what to pack, how excited they were for the excursions I had lined up, what we'd do each day. I felt like I had really hit the nail on the head. Everything seemed perfect. But then things started to go sideways. A few days later, my mom casually mentioned that my cousins were really excited about the idea of coming along. I froze. I wasn't sure if I'd heard her correctly. My cousins? They hadn't been part of the plan at all. They weren't even on my radar. But my mom kept talking about how they'd been struggling financially and how this could be a great opportunity for them to experience something they never would have otherwise. They were so excited about the trip. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was already starting to get frustrated. I didn't say anything at that moment, assuming this was just a passing comment. I thought maybe my mom was just being nice. Maybe she was testing the waters. But the more she spoke, the more it felt like this wasn't just a suggestion, it was a hint. A couple of days later, it was confirmed. My parents had invited my cousins. They explained that it was now a family trip, not just something for them. After a lot of thought, they decided that my cousins should come along. My heart sank. This was the exact opposite of what I had planned. The whole reason I put this trip together was so they could get away from everything, just the two of them. I felt betrayed. All my planning, all my efforts seemed pointless now. I confronted them right away, trying to keep my voice steady but failing. I told them how disappointed I was. I had worked so hard to make this trip perfect, and now it felt like nothing more than a regular family vacation. They apologized, but my mom guilt-tripped me, telling me I was being selfish. It's important for family to be together, she said, and my dad added that they didn't have many opportunities to spend time with my cousins. It was like a punch to the gut. I was hurt. I felt like I had been unappreciated, and I didn't know how to process it. My dream vacation had turned into a nightmare. Update 1. After the argument, I went back to my apartment. I needed space. I had never felt so disrespected in my life. The whole point of planning this trip was to give my parents something special, something they'd remember forever. Now, it felt like I was just another person tagging along on their vacation. I didn't speak to them for a couple of days. It felt easier to just avoid the whole situation and try to figure out what to do next. I considered canceling the trip. The thought crossed my mind a few times. The resort had already been paid for, but I figured I could try to get a refund or at least cut my losses with the flights. But I quickly shot that idea down. The money I'd spent on the trip wasn't a small amount, it was a huge chunk of what I'd worked for. And worse, canceling would mean disappointing my parents, who had already shown so much excitement about the trip. No matter how frustrated I was, I didn't want to make them feel bad for something that should have been a joyous occasion. So I kept quiet and told myself I'd just have to deal with it. But as the days went on, I couldn't help but start second-guessing myself. Was I being too harsh? Maybe it wasn't such a big deal after all. My cousins weren't bad people. They were family. And maybe they didn't have many opportunities to go on a trip like this. It wasn't their fault they wanted in. It was just that this was supposed to be my gift to my parents. They had sacrificed a lot for us over the years, and I wanted to give them something that was just for them, something that didn't involve extended family or anyone else. I wanted to give them a break. But maybe I was being unreasonable, expecting them to completely change their plans for my idea of a perfect vacation. That's when my mom called. I could tell from the moment I answered that she wasn't calling to argue. Her voice was softer, more apologetic. She told me she was sorry for making me feel left out and that it wasn't her intention. She explained that they thought it was important for everyone to bond, and that having the cousins there wasn't meant to hurt me. She said she understood that I had planned everything, but she felt it was the right thing to do. The more she spoke, the more I could tell she was trying to smooth things over. I didn't want to seem like the bad guy. I didn't want to hold a grudge forever, especially not over something that was supposed to be a happy occasion. So, reluctantly, I told her I'd go along with the plan. I didn't want to seem unreasonable or petty. After all, it was still a vacation. It was still going to be something special, and maybe it would turn out better than I thought. But the days leading up to the trip weren't exactly relaxing. My cousins started texting me nonstop about the vacation. They were so excited, talking about everything from what they were going to pack to what excursions they wanted to do. I couldn't even pretend to be as enthusiastic as they were. I just couldn't shake the frustration. It felt like the vacation I had planned was slipping further and further away. I decided to set some boundaries. I texted my cousins, trying to keep things civil. I told them I didn't want things to get out of hand, and that they needed to respect the space I was hoping to have with my parents. I even mentioned that I hoped we could all enjoy the trip without anyone making it feel like a circus. They seemed to get the message, but part of me wasn't convinced that they'd actually follow through. When we finally arrived at the resort, I knew immediately that things weren't going to be the way I envisioned them. My parents were overjoyed to have the cousins there, and they immediately started planning group activities, dinners, and everything else. It didn't feel like the intimate, quiet retreat I had imagined. Instead, it felt like just another family vacation, full of noise and chaos. My cousins were everywhere, at the pool, at the bar, at every meal. It felt like I didn't even matter in the plans anymore. It wasn't just the quantity of attention they were getting, but the quality too. They were getting extra drinks at the pool, special seating at dinner, and all sorts of perks. I started noticing how much attention my parents were giving them, while I was left on the sidelines. The more I saw it, the more it hurt. It was like I didn't even exist in my own gift to my parents. I tried talking to my mom about it, trying to explain how I felt, but it didn't go the way I had hoped. She brushed it off, saying that this was still the vacation she wanted. She said I should just enjoy it, and that we were still having a good time together. That was the moment I realized nothing was going to change. The trip I had planned for months had already become something else entirely. The resentment started building up inside me. Every conversation seemed to revolve around my cousins. Every group activity felt like they were at the center, with me sitting at the edges, watching it all unfold. I felt invisible. I posted a vague message on Reddit about the situation, asking if I was overreacting. The responses I got were mixed, but most people seemed to side with me. I wasn't being unreasonable. I had every right to be upset. But in the end, nothing really changed. On the last day of the trip, I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I told my parents I was done with the vacation. I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine. It wasn't what I had planned. It wasn't what I had hoped for. And I wasn't going to sit there and act like it was. Update 2. When I told my parents I wanted to leave the vacation early, they were absolutely shocked. My mom immediately started crying, and my dad got angry. He called me ungrateful, told me that after everything they'd done for me, I should be more appreciative of the time we were spending together. I could see how hurt they were, but I couldn't back down. I had to stand my ground. I tried to explain the situation. I wasn't upset about the family being there. I'd always known it was important to my parents to spend time with their extended family. But this wasn't just any trip. This was supposed to be their 30th anniversary gift. The whole point was to give them a peaceful, intimate getaway, just the three of us. The moment my cousins showed up, that vision was shattered. I had worked so hard for this, and I felt like my effort didn't matter at all. I told them that I wasn't trying to ruin the trip or be selfish. It wasn't about them, it was about the fact that my gift had been completely changed. I had planned every detail to make this an unforgettable experience for them, and now it felt like a normal family vacation. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't being difficult for no reason. This was something I had genuinely put my heart into, and it wasn't what I'd envisioned. But my parents didn't seem to see it that way. They kept insisting that I was being selfish. They said I was hurting them by acting like this, and they couldn't understand why I couldn't just let things go. They kept talking about how much they had enjoyed having the cousins there. It felt like they couldn't see how much I had sacrificed to make this trip happen. They seemed to think I should just accept it and be happy for the family time. But it wasn't that simple for me. As the argument went on, I realized I wasn't going to get through to them. I was too hurt, and they were too focused on their own feelings. My cousins, who had overheard the argument, came over to comfort me, but it didn't feel genuine at all. I wasn't mad at them, they didn't ask to be part of this. But their presence made everything worse. They acted like they were in the right, and it only added to the feeling that they were taking advantage of the situation. I didn't want to make them feel guilty, but I couldn't help feeling like they had inserted themselves into something that wasn't theirs to claim. The rest of the vacation was pretty much a blur. I spent the next few days in silence. I avoided group activities and stayed out of the way as much as I could. Every time I looked around, I saw my parents and cousins laughing, enjoying the vacation as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I felt completely invisible. I had given up my time, my money, and my energy to make this vacation happen, and now I was the one left out. I could barely look at my parents without feeling angry. When we finally returned home, things only got worse. The tension between me and my parents was palpable. We barely spoke. My parents seemed to think that everything was fine now, but I couldn't just move on from what had happened. I felt emotionally drained from the whole ordeal. The trip was supposed to be a bonding experience, but it left me feeling more disconnected from my parents than ever. A few days after we got back, my parents reached out to apologize. They said they didn't fully understand how I felt, but that they hoped I would let it go. They insisted that the trip had been special in its own way, and they kept pushing the idea that I needed to accept it for what it was. But they didn't understand the root of my frustration. It wasn't about not spending time with family, it was about the fact that they had completely ignored the one thing I had wanted to give them, a private, intimate experience for their anniversary. They had changed my gift without even asking me, and that was what hurt the most. Meanwhile, my cousins continued to act like nothing had happened. They posted vacation photos on social media, tagging me in them as if we'd all had the best time together. Every time I saw one of those photos, I felt like a knife was twisting in my side. They had no idea how much I had sacrificed for this trip to happen. They didn't even seem to care. A few weeks later, we had a family gathering. It was supposed to be a chance for everyone to reconnect, but it only made things worse. My parents kept defending their decision to invite the cousins, saying it was the right choice. They didn't see why I was still upset. It felt like they couldn't see me anymore, only the idea of family togetherness. At the gathering, my aunt made a comment that really stung. She said, "You should be grateful that your cousins were there. They've never been on a trip like this before." It was the final straw. The idea that my parents and relatives thought I should just be happy with what I'd been given, after everything I'd done, was frustrating. I had worked for months to make this trip happen, and all I got in return was guilt and dismissiveness. At that point, I realized I wasn't going to get the closure I needed from my parents. They weren't going to fully understand how much I had sacrificed, and no amount of arguing would change that. I started to reevaluate my relationship with them. I still loved them, but I also felt a growing resentment. It wasn't just about the trip anymore, it was about feeling unappreciated in a way that went beyond just one vacation. I started talking to a therapist about how I was feeling. It helped me put things into perspective. A lot of my frustration was about unmet expectations. I had wanted to create something meaningful, but in the process, I had set myself up for disappointment. I needed to set clearer boundaries with my family to protect my emotional well-being. This wasn't about being selfish, it was about making sure I wasn't constantly putting my needs last for the sake of family harmony. I decided I needed to have one final conversation with my parents. I needed them to understand that I wasn't just going to let this slide. I wasn't asking for an apology that would magically fix everything, but I needed acknowledgement for the hurt I had felt. If I was ever going to move on, they had to see how much this affected me. I didn't know if that would change anything, but it was the only way I could start healing. Update 3. After the fallout from the trip, things between me and my parents got even more distant. Conversations with them became less frequent. It wasn't like we were fighting every day, but there was a clear tension hanging in the air. They seemed to avoid talking about the vacation incident altogether, like they were hoping it would just fade away. I couldn't let it go, though. The more I tried to act like everything was fine, the more I realized that the damage had been done. The holiday season rolled around, and I didn't know how to handle it. The idea of being around my cousins again made me feel uneasy. They'd acted like everything was normal, posting photos from the trip, tagging me in them, and sharing their excitement. But for me, it was a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I didn't want to spend the holidays pretending like I wasn't still hurt by the vacation disaster. Then, one day, my parents surprised me with a gift. It was a token of appreciation for everything I had done, or so they said. But when I opened it, the gesture just felt hollow. It wasn't about the gift itself, it was about the fact that nothing had changed. They had apologized, yes, but the core issue still stood. They didn't fully understand the depth of my feelings, and it felt like the gift was just a way for them to check a box off without actually addressing the problem. That was when I realized that the vacation incident had changed something fundamental in our relationship. It wasn't just about a ruined trip anymore. It was about how they had prioritized everyone else over my effort and my feelings. I couldn't keep pretending like that didn't matter. I had to accept the new normal. My parents weren't going to prioritize me in the way I'd hoped. I could keep pushing for them to see things from my perspective, but I knew that wouldn't fix anything. I came to the harsh realization that they valued family harmony more than understanding my personal struggles. They had their own view of what family meant, and it wasn't one that fully included me. As I sat with that thought, something clicked during a solo trip I took a few weeks later. I went on a weekend getaway just to clear my head. I spent time thinking, reflecting on everything that had happened, and I had a breakthrough. I realized that holding on to my anger and resentment was only hurting me. My relationship with my parents would never be perfect, but I could still find peace within myself. I didn't have to carry this weight forever. I had to let go of the bitterness and focus on what truly mattered moving forward, my own happiness. That realization wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I started forgiving myself for holding on to the anger for so long. It hadn't been easy to confront my feelings, and it was even harder to let go of them, but I knew that holding on to that resentment wasn't worth damaging my relationship with my family any further. I wasn't going to let this one experience define everything I had with them. When I came back home, I felt a lot lighter. Things weren't fixed yet, but I had made peace with myself. I knew I had to take responsibility for my part in the situation, too. I wasn't blameless in all of this. My expectations had been unrealistic, and I hadn't communicated my needs clearly from the start. It wasn't just about what my parents or cousins had done, it was about me not setting the boundaries I needed to avoid feeling hurt in the first place. A few weeks later, I decided to have a conversation with my parents. I wanted to rebuild our relationship, but I needed them to understand how much the trip had affected me. I told them I still felt hurt, but I didn't want to dwell on the past. It was time to move forward. We talked about boundaries, and I made it clear that I needed more transparency when it came to family events. My parents seemed to listen, and we agreed that we would communicate more openly in the future. I also decided to talk to my cousins. I had a conversation with them about how I felt, and while they admitted that they didn't realize how much the trip had meant to me, it still felt like they were just trying to smooth things over. I appreciated their apology, but it wasn't enough to erase everything that had happened. Still, it was a step forward, and for that I was grateful. Over time, things started to feel less tense between me and my parents, but I knew things wouldn't be the same. I could feel the shift. We were no longer as close as we once were, but that didn't mean we couldn't move forward. I started focusing more on myself. I set clearer personal goals, started prioritizing my happiness, and worked on building new friendships that weren't tied to family dynamics. I began to reevaluate family dynamics in general. I realized that family relationships are complicated, and I had to accept that they wouldn't always meet my expectations. I couldn't control everything, and sometimes that meant letting go of certain ideals. But even though I couldn't change everything, I could still maintain my sense of self and create healthier boundaries. I was learning to love my family, but in a way that didn't leave me feeling drained or unappreciated. Things weren't perfect, but I was starting to see a path forward. I wasn't expecting everything to be fixed overnight, but I was willing to put in the work. And that made all the difference. Update 4. It's been a few months since the vacation disaster, and I've had plenty of time to reflect on what happened. I've learned that family dynamics are far more complicated than I originally thought, and that trip really opened my eyes to a lot of things. As much as I wanted everything to be perfect, I had to accept that things don't always go as planned, and that sometimes the messiness of life is just part of the deal. Looking back, I began to see my parents in a new light. I used to think they had all the answers, that they knew exactly how to handle every situation. But the vacation showed me that they weren't perfect, and they were doing the best they could with the tools they had. They might not have handled things in the way I would have liked, but that didn't mean they didn't care. They were trying in their own way. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't blameless in all of this. My need for control and my high expectations had led to a lot of miscommunication. I wanted everything to go perfectly, and when it didn't, I felt betrayed. But I hadn't set clear expectations with my parents, and that caused a lot of resentment to build up. It wasn't just their fault. I had contributed to the situation too. A few months after everything settled down, the idea of another family vacation started floating around again. I was hesitant at first. The last one had gone so horribly wrong, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go through the same thing again. But then I had an idea. Maybe this time I could take a more flexible approach. I didn't want to go into this vacation with the same rigid expectations as before. Instead of planning everything myself, I decided to propose a new idea. Let's make it a family decision. I told my parents and cousins that I was happy to help plan, but I wanted everyone to have a say. This way, we could find a compromise that worked for everyone. Surprisingly, they were all on board. We sat down for a family meeting to discuss vacation ideas, and it felt different this time. There was a sense of cooperation in the air. Everyone was willing to make compromises. My cousins, who had always been a bit pushy in the past, seemed more understanding now. My parents were listening more closely. We all agreed that the goal was to make sure everyone was happy, even if it meant adjusting some of our expectations. It wasn't about having the perfect trip anymore, it was about creating something that felt good for the whole family. In that meeting, I realized something important. Compromise wasn't about giving up what I wanted entirely. It was about finding a middle ground where everyone's needs could be met to some extent. It was a lesson I had learned the hard way, but now it felt like I was ready to put it into practice. It was also a realization that I didn't need to be the one who made all the decisions or carried the burden of responsibility for everyone's happiness. We were a family, and we all had a role to play in making things work. The new approach felt refreshing, and it made me think about how we could create new family traditions. For years, the holidays and family gatherings had been about the same old routine, but I realized there was room to create something more inclusive. We could have more open communication, set clear expectations, and work together to make family events feel like something we all wanted to be part of, not just something that was planned around one person's idea of what was best. To test out the new approach, I decided to organize a small weekend trip with just my immediate family. It wasn't a big vacation, just a short getaway to see how the new family dynamic would play out. I was nervous at first. It felt like a risk, but I was determined to make it work. And to my surprise, it went really well. There were still moments of tension, of course. We're family, and that's inevitable. But there were also moments of real connection. We spent time together, shared meals, and talked in a way that felt more genuine than before. It was clear that the old patterns of communication, where I felt like I had to plan everything and make sure everyone was happy, weren't there anymore. We were all just being ourselves, and it felt good. Over the weekend, I started to see my family in a new light. My relationships with them deepened in ways I hadn't expected. There were fewer tensions, less stress, and more laughter. I could tell that they were trying to meet me halfway, and that meant a lot. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It felt like we were finally moving forward. as a family and as individuals. I also came to realize that family dynamics aren't static. They change over time. What I once thought was a betrayal was, in hindsight, just a part of the complex nature of family relationships. People grow, people change, and sometimes that means the way we interact with each other evolves. It's not always easy, but it's part of the process. I had to let go of the past, accept that things weren't going to be perfect, and move forward with an open mind. As for my role in the family, I came to accept that I wasn't always going to be the peacemaker or the person who made the grand gestures. That was okay. It was enough to just be myself, to contribute to the family in the ways that felt right for me. I didn't need to take on all the responsibility for making everything work. We were all in this together, and that's what mattered. At the end of the weekend, my parents expressed their gratitude for my understanding and for being willing to work through things with them. We agreed that moving forward, we would make more room for open communication and compromise. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. Looking back on everything, I realized that the vacation incident no longer haunted me. It had been a painful lesson, but it was one that shaped how I viewed my family and myself. It taught me the importance of setting boundaries, of communicating openly, and of accepting that things won't always go as planned. In the end, that experience helped me grow, not just as an individual, but as part of a family. And while it wasn't always easy, I knew that I was finally on the right path to healing and growth. Update 5. As the next holiday season approached, I knew it was time to put everything I'd learned into action. I had spent so much time focusing on the past, on what went wrong with the vacation, that it was finally time to look ahead. I decided to take it upon myself to organize a family reunion of sorts. But this time, things would be different. I wasn't going to plan everything on my own. I made sure that everyone, my parents, cousins, and other extended family, had a voice in the planning process. The previous year had shown me just how important it was to make sure everyone felt heard. So I took a step back and let the planning process be a family effort. We sat down together, talked about our expectations, and figured out what everyone wanted out of the gathering. It wasn't about one person's vision anymore. It was about compromise and making sure everyone felt included. It wasn't easy at first, but slowly we found our rhythm. There were moments of disagreement, of course, but the conversations were more open, and we respected each other's opinions. During this time, I had a chance to reflect on how much I had grown since the original vacation incident. Looking back, I realized that I wasn't searching for validation anymore. I wasn't looking for my family's approval or for them to praise me for what I had done. I had shifted my focus. I was now more interested in building meaningful connections with the people I loved, regardless of what I had planned or how things had turned out in the past. I wasn't focused on proving myself anymore. I just wanted to make sure I was present, emotionally available, and that I was truly connecting with my family. The support from my parents during this process was a huge step forward. They expressed their gratitude for the new traditions I was trying to establish, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were collaborating as a family. They didn't try to take over or push their own agenda. Instead, they supported the idea of working together. My dad even offered to help with some of the logistics, something he hadn't done in the past. It felt like we were finally on the same page. A few months later, we took the family vacation we had been planning. The trip was a success, but not in the way I'd originally imagined. It wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was balanced. Everyone had a say and no one felt left out. We managed to compromise on things like activities, meals, and accommodations, and that made all the difference. For the first time, I wasn't the only one making the decisions. It felt like we were all in it together, and that was exactly what I had wanted from the start. When we returned from the vacation, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had been dreading bringing up the anniversary trip from the year before, but it was time to acknowledge the past. I sat down with my parents, and we had an honest conversation about what had happened. We all agreed that the trip had been a huge learning experience for everyone. My parents acknowledged that they hadn't fully understood how much the trip meant to me, and I admitted that I had placed too much pressure on them to see things my way. We both understood that things hadn't gone as planned, but we were okay with that now. We had learned from it, and that was what mattered. Over time, my relationship with my cousins also began to improve. After everything that happened, we were all a bit more cautious around each other, but we started to learn how to respect each other's boundaries. We didn't always agree on everything, but we found ways to coexist without stepping on each other's toes. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Letting go of the resentment that had built up over the past year was incredibly freeing. The anger I had held onto for so long no longer clouded my interactions with my family. I realized that my feelings were no longer tied to past hurts. I was finally able to embrace a healthier perspective on family. Yes, things had gone wrong, but they had also gone right in other ways, and it was time to focus on those positives. The role of family in my life started to shift as well. I began to understand that family isn't perfect, but that doesn't mean they don't care. We all make mistakes, and learning from them is what truly matters. My parents weren't perfect, and neither was I, but we could still love each other. We could still be a family, even if things weren't always how we expected. During the next family gathering, I took a moment to express my gratitude for the way we had all grown. I thanked everyone for their willingness to compromise, for respecting each other's boundaries, and for making the effort to build new traditions. It wasn't easy, but it felt like we were finally getting somewhere. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly connected to my family. I was finally able to establish boundaries with my family that felt healthy. I had learned that it was okay to put myself first sometimes, and that it was okay to say no. My family respected those boundaries more than ever before, and that made all the difference. We were able to have healthier interactions, ones that didn't leave me feeling drained or unappreciated. With the family dynamics more stable, I started to feel a deeper sense of personal fulfillment. I wasn't seeking validation from my family anymore. Instead, I was building my own happiness. I focused on setting personal goals, pursuing things that were important to me, and nurturing my own well-being. The trip had taught me that I was responsible for my own happiness, not my family. I could love them, and they could love me, but my sense of self-worth didn't depend on their approval. The vacation incident was finally behind me. It had been a hard lesson, but it was one that ultimately made me a stronger person. I had learned so much about myself, about my family, and about how to navigate complex relationships. Looking ahead, I felt optimistic. With clearer boundaries, open communication, and a healthier relationship with my family, I knew we could face whatever challenges came our way. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next.